Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, it's Child Abuse Prevention Month, but first, catch our special interview with U.S. Senator Bob Casey, and we'll do all of that after these words.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, as often is the case, Senator Robert Casey comes on our program. We're delighted to have him. And as I like to point out, both the governor of this state and both U.S. senators have standing invitations to come on this program, as you do, of course. And you were on when you were state treasurer and auditor general as well. I remember those days. At any rate, Senator, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I guess I have to start with the obvious question about the Syrian chemical attack, the response by President Trump. You know, they launched over 100 missiles into 3 sites where apparently there was a lot of development of these chemical weapons. Some conservatives think he should have done more if you watch some of the cable channels. Right. What's your sense? You used to be on the Foreign Relations Committee, if I recall this. You're an expert in this area. What's your position on what the president did, and what should we do?
Well, Terry, first of all, great to be with you again.
Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm an expert, but I spent some time on these issues. I'd say this first and foremost. I think it's important that not only the president, but the Congress focus on an atrocity like we saw in Syria. That's why I said 2 things about what the president did. He did it without authority from Congress. I think he should seek that authority. Mm-hmm. And he did it without a strategy. I think if he did both of those things, seek authority from Congress for an authorization for this kind of action against Syria, and secondly, outline a comprehensive strategy, we could have a much more bipartisan approach to this.
Yeah, he also wants to get, then even as we speak, there were suggestions again that he says, let's pull out completely from Syria.
Yeah, contradictory in a short time frame. But I think it speaks to a larger question about the grave question of war. When you engage in any kind of a hostile action, even one that's imposed upon a country that's engaged in the kind of horrors that Bashar al-Assad is engaged in, who is, in my judgment, a war criminal and should be held accountable. Mm-hmm. The Russians and the Iranians should be held accountable as well. Yeah. That's why you need a comprehensive strategy. Yeah. But it also, I think, points to this larger question of what do we do about the grave question of war? Congress should play its appropriate role here. And I think this has been, frankly, for many years, a bipartisan failure. Mm-hmm. Congress should debate the issue of war, the authorization, so-called AUMF, authorization for the use of military force, debate it and vote on it and stand up and be counted. But unfortunately, Congress has delegated over many, many years, many administrations, too much authority to the president. Yeah. And Congress should vote on an authorization.
Well, the good news, the other news about it, that at least what the president did, he did it with 2 of our allies, France and England. We didn't go it alone, and it seems that the sentiment in much of the West was favorable towards it. I don't think anybody could disagree that Congress needs to play its appropriate role.
No question, no question.
All right, well, let's go to another issue. Both in the state legislature and in Congress, in the Pennsylvania state legislature, you all have been debating gun control, and the question remains, and as you know, assault weapon ban, more with background checks. Teachers, arming teachers seems to be out. Most of the sentiment in this state anyway, as far as I've heard, is against that. Teachers organizations plus organizations that represent school management, they're holding their hands up and saying, no, we don't want to do this. What's going to happen in Congress with gun control?
Well, I hope more would happen, and that's really back to this question of debating and voting. If the American people saw the Senate doing its job, which it's not now on common sense gun measures, we'd be having a long debate and then a series of votes, or individual debates on individual amendments that could at least reduce the likelihood not only that a school shooting like in Parkland, right, but any kind of violence, gun violence would happen on a more regular basis. Reducing that likelihood can happen if you have a series of measures that some of what you just mentioned, whether it's a background check bill, which I think has broad support, a whole series of measures you could put in place that would reduce the likelihood. Is it a magic wand? No. Does it mean you eliminate the possibility of gun violence? No. But we have to step back and ask ourselves, and I ask myself this question, especially after the horror of Sandy Hook, that elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut, back in December of 2012. I asked myself, are we saying that the greatest country in the world can do absolutely nothing to reduce the likelihood of gun violence? I think you're seeing a lot of gun owners saying finally that they want to be part of the solution.
We're going to run to a break, but universal background check, I mean, we're talking about 90% plus in most polls, and many of them are, as you accurately point out, gun owners. And we come back, have many more questions to ask the senator.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Well, Senator Robert Casey is my special guest this week. We're chatting about a whole range of items. All right, Senator, as you know, there was a bipartisan spending bill, $1.3 trillion. Do I have that number about correct? There were proposals in there that relate specifically to Pennsylvania, correct?
Absolutely.
Let's talk about those.
Yeah, a variety of measures or I should say programs and initiatives that had not been invested in a long time. Obviously, there was an increase in defense spending, and that was appropriate. We need more for defense. We got that. But the increase in some domestic programs is critical. Child care, for example, and Head Start went up by almost $3 billion. The opioid crisis, which has engulfed so much of Pennsylvania, especially rural Pennsylvania, more than $3 billion for that. We're going to add more to that in the next
And I'm going to interrupt you.
Yes.
Of all the things that you debate in Congress, and the debate goes on in the Pennsylvania legislature, and Republicans and Democrats really divided, thank God that's one thing there's bipartisan support for. Go ahead.
The problem is so bad that both parties agree we've got to do something about it. And there's more to do on the opioid crisis. An increase in infrastructure investment, not enough, but a good down payment. And a consensus, I think, in Congress to do something more about rural broadband in these rural communities where kids can't learn, businesses can't grow because they don't have high-speed internet. Another area which was significant in this spending bill was to make sure that we don't cut back on block grants that go to communities all across Pennsylvania. The proposal by the administration was to completely eliminate that program. But it actually got an increase of about $300 million. So whether it's health care or law enforcement, whether it was infrastructure or programs that protect our families, it was a good bipartisan effort. Not perfect, but certainly an effort where both parties came together to invest in jobs and health care and growing the economy.
You know, one of the things I've talked about over the years is, in some respects, you're a different kind of Democrat. You can smile about that. I mean, you've paid a lot of attention to blue-collar workers. I joke and say, you know where Menneson and Johnstown and Erie in the state are, and you visited them, and you've been a pretty tough critic of what President Trump has wanted to do. I mean, I'm being candid about it. I read your stuff. I mean, you know, the information you're... But when it comes to trade and jobs for Pennsylvania workers, particularly blue-collar workers, you're going to stand with the president, whether he's a Democrat or Republican, or whether you can take that away if you want. Go ahead.
No, but I do think that there's an area of great bipartisan consensus on a couple of major issues. This would involve the president. This would involve Democrats and Republicans. One of them is infrastructure. You just think about. I was looking at these numbers recently. 3 counties in your viewing area, the 3 biggest: Lancaster, Dauphin, and York counties.
Right.
You add those up. There's almost 300 bridges that are structurally deficient. Now, will they fall down next Wednesday or 6 months from now?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah.
But we should be targeting infrastructure dollars to the highest risk bridges. We should also, as I mentioned before, invest in broadband. So there's a whole range of infrastructure investments.
Bipartisan.
Could be bipartisan. The other area I think where there's a great deal of bipartisanship is on trade. We need trade agreements that give our workers an advantage, or at least a level playing field. And I do think that where the president has emphasized the damage that China has done to our economy, I think we've got to be very determined in a bipartisan way to check China, not to hold them to a different standard. But when China cheats, we lose jobs. When they cheat on trade deals, when they attack our intellectual property, when they hack into U.S. Steel and Pennsylvania companies, we need to have a reaction to that. And I believe that if we have a strategy that confronts China in an appropriate way, just to insist that China follows the rules, I think our workers will benefit.
Good point. All right, we're going to run to a break. DACA and the wall. I want to check in with that, and we'll see where we go with a couple of other things, and we'll do all of that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
All right, my last segment with Senator Casey. All right, there's a big issue. As everybody in the universe, I think, knows, President Trump wants to build the wall. He also says he'll give you Democrats DACA. Whether or not that leads as a path to citizenship's another matter. I know you've spoken out on this on a number of occasions. For our viewing audience here, what do you think should happen with DACA and the wall and whatever else goes on the border?
Well, I think what should happen is what almost happened a couple of weeks ago when we had a bipartisan bill where, frankly, a lot of Republicans stuck their neck out to get a bipartisan agreement which said we can have in the same bill a solution for young people to keep that American promise to those young people who came here through no fault of their own and need a solution and need protection.
And by the way, they're basically Americans, aren't they, at this point?
Right. They've come forward, and our government promised them, if you come forward and make disclosures, we'll protect you. And that promise hasn't been kept. But keep that promise on with regard to the so-called DACA program, but also to add some border security dollars. That compromise was sitting there for the president, and after promising that he would take the heat and sign any bill, he abandoned, frankly, his own party. It made no sense to me. So I'm hoping that if we can get a similar measure that deals with DACA but also has some border security or whatever element can get Republican support that we can get there. But unfortunately, that went down. I hope the president will lead his party in the direction of solving at least this problem. Then we can get to the larger issue of immigration itself.
Well, it seems to me that if you're a violent criminal, if you're a felon and you're illegally here, then send you home. If you're not, we're not kicking out 13 million people, Senator.
Right.
I mean, I don't think I'm on Mars to talk about someplace far away when I say that. And we ought to have some measure of border security and determine how many. Go ahead. You've studied this.
Interesting, Terry. We were what you just outlined is pretty much where we were in 2013, 5 years ago. It's hard to believe it's that long ago, where both parties came together, 68 members of the United States Senate. A lot of Republicans and even more Democrats voted for a bill that dealt with every big issue. We ought to get back to that, where the parties come together, because deporting 11 or 12 or whatever the number is of millions of people makes no sense. And if that's your only proposal, I don't think you're solving the problem.
Before I let you go, as you look forward in the next, I'll just say couple of months, what do you think? It's very divided Congress. What do you think you all can do?
Well, I think if you step back and look at it more broadly, I hope that both parties would focus on jobs and wages principally. There's a lot we can do on jobs and wages. I think in terms of near-term issues, if we could get a solution to the DACA issue, that would be productive. Have a bipartisan consensus on infrastructure, even if it had to be scaled back. Focus on roads and bridges and broadband to start at least. The other thing I hope we can do is get a farm bill done. If we got a farm bill done, and I'm on the Ag Committee, in 2018, it would set a record. We haven't done it on time in many, many years. It would be good for our dairy farmers to make some corrections. It would be good for the rural economy of Pennsylvania because a lot of those families have been hurting, and they expect Congress to get that farm bill done.
Well, look, as I've said before, you're welcome on this program anytime. So is Senator Toomey. I've made that point over and over again. We're delighted that you come in and share your views with folks in our state. I know you do a lot of traveling around the state. All right, coming up, it's Child Abuse Prevention Month. We got a very important segment on that. Stay with us.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
Well, Angela Liddle joins me. She's the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Family Support Alliance, and this is Child Abuse Prevention Month. Do I got that right?
You do, Terry.
But I'm going to tell you something. Every month ought to be Child Abuse Prevention Month. I can't think of another subject that, quite frankly, is more important than this.
Absolutely. And few members of Pennsylvania citizenry really understand that we've had 46 kids killed as a result of child abuse in 2016 and over 4,400 substantiated cases of child abuse.
You know, it seems to me, and I want to talk with you in a few minutes about some legislation, but it seems to me that what happens is it's usually within a family, either, you know, the close personal family or the extended family, and people may not even be aware of it, and the victims just simply won't come forward for a whole variety of reasons. And it's something that for most of American history, did anybody even talk about it?
Well, evidently not nearly enough. You know, just this past weekend, we had the airing of the Joe Paterno movie with the Sandusky scandal. And, you know, the takeaways on that are that there were lots of kids saying lots of things, and folks just didn't listen closely enough. And then when they did see or know something, they didn't act on it in a way that they should have to better protect kids. So that's one of the neat things about Pennsylvania Family Support Alliance. We work really hard through talking with partners like you in the media to make sure that people understand everyone has a role to play in keeping kids safe.
Well, you're welcome on this program anytime. This is an important subject. Now, before we get into, I do want to talk about legislation, but before I do that, how much of this is connected, do you think, child abuse and opioids and drugs and the fact that and what's that relationship like?
Well, that actually segues right into some of the legislative things that are in the pipeline right now. You know, we have about 60% of families who are known to the child welfare system in each county have some level of substance use disorder. And one of the things that we see is an increasing trend in grandparents who are raising grandchildren because of either a death or substance use disorder where they're not able to parent their children. So we have about 82,000 grandparents in Pennsylvania estimated that are raising close to 90,000 kids.
Wow.
Imagine being in the prime of life and headed for retirement, and you're starting all over with parenting. So it's a large impact, and it's one that has policymakers and folks who work in child welfare are very concerned.
Is that the Kinship Caregiver Navigator Program? That has a long title.
It does. It does.
That's
well,
all right.
Actually, there's a couple pieces of legislation right now. You know, Representative Eddie Pashinsky, Luzerne County area, and then Representative Kathy Watson, the chair of the House Children and Youth Committee. So there are bills that would establish temporary guardianship for grandparents, because God forbid these folks end up getting these 11 o'clock at night calls saying you have to come get your grandchild. And they begin the next day trying to figure out how to establish education and health care and all of those things.
Yeah, let me step in here. So let's say that there's child abuse within the nuclear family, and it gets known, and there may be some prosecutions. Is that where is that one of the ways in which grandparents and other folks in the extended family would come in?
Sure. I mean, it's always preferable to try to keep children, if they're safe, with a grandparent or other kin. Yeah. Obviously, our foster care system, it costs on average almost $25,000 a year to have a child in foster care. So for the benefit of the children and for really the benefit of the family, we want to try to keep folks together as much as we're able to. So with that is the Kinship Navigator bill. That's working through the legislative process right now, and that's something that would help grandparents have access to services where they'd have someone through a hotline that could tell them what services are available.
That's a great idea, because, you know, things change. Grandparents, you know, they may not have had kids in the family for 30 or 40 years. Go ahead, I interrupted you.
Absolutely. So, you know, we need to make sure that these folks know what services are available and what supports they can expect as they re-enter the parenting role. And that's obviously something we need to do to keep kids out of the foster care system.
All right, before I let you go, so what are you all doing during this month?
We've been doing all kinds of things.
I know, I shouldn't have asked you this at the end of the segment.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, give me a couple of quick highlights.
We've turned the Capitol blue. You may have seen that with over 4,400 blue flags. Wonderful support from businesses where blue lights went on, restaurants on 2nd Street, the State Street corridor.
I was going to say, not just the Capitol, but down State Street, right?
We've really turned it into a movement, Terry, and we added a couple of things this year because what we know is that folks need visuals. So we added a memorial garden of flags for those 46 kids who were killed. We're off to having painting for prevention murals done in many communities with elected officials and community advocates, people who work in child welfare. So it's a very, very busy month. But we really thank you for helping spread the word that every citizen has a role to play in keeping kids safe. And we hope people learn about that by visiting pa-fsa.org.
Well, look, this is a very important program, and anything we can do to assist in making sure that we keep kids safe. There's, as I said, I don't think there's another. I mean, what else could we do in society if we can't keep the kids safe, not just from abuse, but make sure they get appropriate medical care? I mean. All right, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.